Hello, everybody. This is the very first episode of the XR Reality Check podcast. This is a podcast where we take normal people and XR rebels in a call to debate XR controversies. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about freedom of press, and I'm going to explain just briefly what the XR position of freedom of press is. So basically, XR doesn't think the UK has a free press. There's too much influence from fossil fuel companies and also rich billionaires kind of thing. Picture like Rupert Murdoch and stuff. The result of this is that climate change is often underrepresented or even denied in the media, and that's obviously a really big issue as far as climate change. I'd like to say a big thank you to Sam, Ethan, Zoe, Izzy and Tommy for joining, because everyone had really cool perspectives on this, and other than that, I hope you enjoy. The first thing that came to me when I was thinking about this is, do people think it's possible to underrepresent climate change, and do we think it's happening in the press right now?
It depends where you look, I guess, because if you're looking into certain, publications, then it's definitely not, but I also am big dumb and don't read mainstream media stuff, or really anything, because I don't know how to read. So I feel like it can always definitely be covered more, but is it underrepresented? I don't know. Maybe, but then I'm kind of correlating underrepresentation with the lack of action on government part, so probably it could be represented enough, but there's just not enough action. I don't know. I don't read newspapers or watch the news because it makes me depressed. So someone else who
Yes.
actually does that is gonna have to speak up, I guess.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective because it's quite difficult to decide how you measure whether it's being underrepresented. I think Isabel raised her hand first, so you can go for whatever you'd like to say about that.
No, I was also gonna just say that I don't normally check out the news or but I mostly find out the information on social media, and I feel there are different sides, which is good. So you can see opinions on both sides. But I feel especially now, there's a lot more information, especially on social media. You know, they'll just do the little they'll have the slides where there's just snippets of information. So they're just there and easy to understand, and they're quite good for I don't know, I feel like they're quite good at the moment for understanding what's going on, but I don't really know about mainstream news, newspapers and stuff.
Yeah, those Instagram thingies are a very good source because they're completely voluntary and everyone just shares them. And that's how a lot of the Black Lives Matter and stuff started off as being shared by, which is really good.
But then there's the argument that they're not very good because they are independently done and not necessarily fact-checked and all that stuff, so...
Yeah, that is true as well.
But I also get all my information through social media, so I can't fucking talk.
Fair enough.
Maybe even worse, I get it through my friends, so it's definitely not biased at all.
Yeah, I just read the WhatsApp group chat about people talking about the news. That's pretty much
Yeah.
pretty much everything. Sam, what do you have to say about this kind of thing?
Yeah, I was going to raise similar points, really, how it depends on your perception of how we should measure the amount of reporting. If, for example, someone from the point of view of Extinction Rebellion might argue that there needs to be more kind of persuasive material put forward, which I think newspapers such as The Guardian, for example, are doing a good job of. Also, Good Morning Britain have quite regularly now this graph, well, not graph, I don't know what the official term for it would be, but a kind of measurement showing the gradual heating of the world. But also, as you say, there's I disagree about the impact of social media being a positive thing, because it's definitely an echo chamber in many ways. So if you're following these accounts and you're interested in that, then of course you'll be seeing lots of it pop up. But if you're not, then you're not going to see it at all. But also there is the issue they're not independent, and there's a lot of information arising which doesn't actually have cited sources. So, for example, I get really annoyed about something about anti-vaxxers campaigns, particularly among young people, which is really surprising. Instead of suggesting me a failure in education, but there's a lot of people claiming, oh, does this and this, or this and this, and I always say to them, can you reference an academic article? Can you point to a published source anywhere? And I say, well, I saw it on Facebook or on Twitter or on TikTok. I can't find it anymore. And it's just these worrying, because how far does that go? Because a lot of people make points, if we look outside of the issue of climate change, about other what could be perceived political events. For example, with Trump's recent debacle in Washington, and people claim that, oh, they're idiots and things. But if they're in that same perspective, seeing the same things over and over without actual references, then there's a significant danger to social media, I think.
It's easy to condemn people who fall prey to misinformation as idiots when really they have in their mind a very compelling argument which they believe is the truth. And a lot of the time they use the argument that it's like repressed or like, it's being like it's the hidden truth or whatever. I guess in terms of using Trump stuff, that like they think there's like a hidden cabal behind that Trump is gonna like stop, and that's why he had dealings with Epstein. That's something that I read, is that he was trying to expose the true dark pedophile ring or whatever. So a lot of the time these people are like, it's the actual truth, and the only reason mainstream doesn't show it or teach it, especially with stuff like vaccines and stuff like that, is because they have an incentive to not, whatever that incentive may be that people have come up with.
Yeah, that's definitely very true about incentives and stuff, and there's a lot of stuff to talk about incentives, and I've got a slide full of stuff like that, so that's going to be very interesting to talk about. Go on, Zoe, what were you going to say?
I'm not sure I'm still threaded on your question, Kai, but I think it was, because it was a little while ago now, but I think the question was around, is there enough or the right kind of information in the media on climate, etc.? And there's a lot more than there was, but there's still not enough and the right sort of information in the right way, I would say, because, so for example, if we take the BBC, and it sounds like none of you guys on here would take much notice of the BBC unless it's on social media, which is fine. And yet, quite a lot of people do, maybe just older generations, but they also vote a lot and do those things. So what the BBC says still kind of has some sway. But if we, the BBC, for example, and to a degree, probably a similar degree, quite a lot of other mainstream media outlets, they often fail to share the kind of biggest and most scariest stuff on climate, and they fail to ensure it's understood. So the BBC's purpose, if you look on their website, their purpose is to inform, educate, and entertain. That's what they exist as our main, as our public service broadcaster. And obviously the entertain bit is like, yeah, okay, fine. But the inform and educate, I still think they're largely failing to inform and educate the British public on the realities of the climate emergency. So, I'll just give one example. Well, there's loads of examples, but I'll just give one for now. The Committee on Climate Change last June published their latest annual report on the government's progress on reducing emissions, etc., and not only was the government's progress rubbish, of course, which doesn't get anything like as much publicity as it should, the actual level of rubbishness of the government's progress, but also buried in the report was a recommendation that the government prepare the country to adapt to a 4-degree future. Now, and a lot, esteemed global scientists would say that 4 degrees is not survivable and not for a lot of people, and not compatible with modern civilization. And that's buried in a kind of official government report. It doesn't even get a mention. It's not on the BBC website. It's not tucked away anywhere. It's not even mentioned. But it is official guidance from the government's watchdog that they have to prepare the country for 4 degrees. That that should be kind of mainstream news. but it doesn't even get a mention. So I mean, there's loads of more things I could highlight, but that's just a pretty big one.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
quite,
given on the
um,
fact
quite
that most people
scary.
here probably haven't heard about that until now, that kind of proves that point in that it doesn't cover that much.
Yeah, and you know, if you didn't know anything about the Committee on Climate Change and you didn't actually follow the relevant media or social media or read the 90 odd page report or whatever and actually see it, or follow people who do see it, people wouldn't know. And yet that is guidance, you know, official government guidance to our government is that. And you know, I would dearly love every young person, because I'm conscious I'm much older than everyone else on this call, by the sound of it. And I would dearly love every young person and every university student to be fully aware of that fact, and then we can act accordingly together.
Yeah, very, very true, I think. What are you going to say, Sam?
Yeah, I was going to bring us back maybe to the main point. And yeah, so if we're going to construct this narrative, which you've quite persuasively put forward, and I would agree with, that there's not enough mainstream, I don't want to say coverage, that doesn't really grasp the sense of the gravity of the situation, but you know what I mean, the kind of emphasis on the situation being quite significant and this information not being put out as much as it may need to be, or is reflecting the situation that we don't see. I think if we bring it back to the actions of Extinction Rebellion in response to the papers and arguing that they weren't publishing enough to therefore obstruct it, isn't that kind of counterproductive, I would say, because as we've said repeatedly, young people seem to be more aware because of the spread of social media. If elderly people are not so much, wouldn't it be better to target them with an information campaign as opposed to having heavy debates that attract a lot of attention in the news and present the wrong image? So leafleting, etc. More things that would target these people with the information that needs to get to them.
Sorry.
So, you might not want me to come back on this. If you want someone else to, Kai, that's fine. But if you're happy to,
No, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. I mean, 2 or 3 points I read on that. I suppose, you know, because I am quite old, I've been around quite a long time, and I know that, you know, there's many of us who've tried for years and decades, in fact, to get messages across to the general public in all the kind of normal, polite ways, like leaflets and events and community things and all sorts, and it's not worked. That's why we're here. We're in, you know, on the edge of utter catastrophe, and it doesn't work. Or not very much. It works at a really incremental level, and we are 30 years past time for incremental, so we haven't got time for that. And there was I do read lots of news and lots of articles, but there was an interesting article in the Independent a little time back that talked about the effectiveness of the stuff that XR does. That's not about how popular it is, but how effective it is. And they were differentiating. It wasn't. I think it was some work that had been done by a different agency or evaluator, but so it wasn't the Independent doing the work, but they were reporting on the work, that the level of kind of brand recognition, if you like, and the level of approval, etc., of a whole range of different charities, NGOs, environmental organisations, and basically XR came out with pretty much the highest recognition. So we don't care whether people like us or not, frankly. It's about getting the message across. So, you know, they're not likely to like us because, you know, people didn't like the suffragettes, people didn't like all sorts of movements who've tried civil disobedience, etc. In the past. But we're not trying to be liked, we're trying to get the issues in the media. And we do see that public awareness really increases when we do stuff, because the media do start covering it and people start looking at it. So to that extent, you know, the level of public awareness increase has been improved by the stuff that we've done. That's not to say that all the actions XR does are the right sort of actions. I don't think anyone would agree that everything is done right. But yeah, I think it's not about us being popular, and it's also not about incremental change. We're far too late for that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Sam, what would you say to that?
Just a quick response, really. I think I understand your point. You definitely have more experience than me here, so I can't comment on much authority on it. But if like you say, a large amount of the voting population is elderly, middle age upwards, and if we really need to take serious action, which I agree with you probably do, it makes more sense to work with the population than it does against it. Because when, like, as a historian, I should probably address this. You give examples of suffragettes and other social movements in the past weren't popular, which is correct in many cases. However, the impact of society is quite a long, drawn-out thing. So it's only really acceptable to be supportive of a female franchise in the modern society because of the long drawn-out process of several waves of feminism resulting from that, and then increasing popularity towards it. So I just think I can't buy the fact that the popularity doesn't matter as much, because surely focusing on the popularity and trying different methods that wouldn't alienate certain sections of society would bring them and encompass them into this movement that's important, really, rather than potentially delaying it. Because from much experience of talking to elderly people, often they look on with disgust at the actions of Seniors Rebellion, and unfortunately it is the more headline grabbing events that do grab attention and can be damaging, I think, especially if it comes to national polls and national votes and things. It's not exactly a benefit to have that kind of past, I think.
Isn't the main sort of point against that, though, the fact that with the suffragettes and stuff, there wasn't a literal ticking time bomb of the world's going to end if we don't have equality with people? Like, they did have the opportunity to have the time to build up through several different waves, where if we were to build up through several different waves, there would be several waves of tsunamis and natural disasters that happen around the world, which would be a direct consequence of this being a problem which could have been and should have been prevented earlier. But because we were building popularity instead of making changes, then it would have just spiraled out of control. So even though people are like, we should stop this, it's at that point too late to be stopped. That's my immediate interpretation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's the precise thing I'm criticising, because with the movements such as suffragettes of the past, the fact that they're unpopular meant that their impact on society had to be drawn out, because it took longer to persuade them to forget the fact. Like, for example, the suffragettes were correct to say the law changed in 1928, women getting the vote, etc. But in terms of society actually accepting that, and in terms of women actually accepted into politics, things like the canteen rejecting women still. There's many accounts of female politicians in the 1920s and 30s describing it as a men's boarding school where they were rejected, not accepted. In terms of these actualised social changes on a base level, I just worry that it wouldn't get that same. And because of the sense of urgency, which I agree there is, surely a different approach is necessary, which doesn't rely on this drawn-out process of a big event and a long kind of change as a result of that single event. You need a big momentum now, which incorporates as many people as possible.
I see. We'll do a couple more points on this subject, and then we'll switch it up a little bit. But for now, Zoe, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit tangential, but it is related to what the last speaker said, in the sense of, well, two things really. One is, I don't think history would tell us that significant social change happens through a single thing. You know, there's never one thing going on in a system, is there? It's very complex how human change actually happens. And yet, I think the evidence, the social research evidence, would say that having movements of civil resistance and peaceful civil disobedience, etc., is an important ingredient, or has been an important ingredient to most significant social change. But it's not the only thing that's happening. You know, there's other stuff happening in civil society and in politics and other types of movements and influencing behind the scenes. There's always more than one thing going on. So I guess that was the point that I wanted to make. And linked to that point, you know, we've got, it's not we in XR, it's a separate movement in its own right, but the team supporting and running the campaign for the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, the CEE bill. You know, that's a route that's going down the kind of, you know, grassroots, more regular grassroots campaigning and political route, similar to what was used for the Climate Change Act in 2008. So there are many ways to get the lid off a jam jar, and you know, we all have to use the different ways to get the lid off the jam jar. It's probably maybe not be a good analogy, by the way, but so yeah, I think there are many different routes, and there's no single one route on its own that's enough. But I do believe the actions that XR do are integral to the change that we need, albeit that some actions don't land too well, and we need to learn from that. And I think we have learned a lot from that. And I think the September rebellion with the press action showed that we've learned a lot.
Also, with the involving, like, there's different paths and stuff that people should be taking. I think, like, yeah, probably, but it's the fact that, like, I can't say what that path would be. Like, thinking back to Sam's thing, that there needs to be a different path. I don't know what an effective route would be for that to take, or at least one that would take place in a reasonable amount of time, because it seems that a lot of stuff has been tried time and time again. Like you said, you've been doing this for years and years, and it still hasn't gained enough traction in a way. So, like, if there is a clear method that can be, like, followed, and it's like, yeah, this worked before, or, you know, this will theoretically work like that, then obviously people probably, they would already be doing that. But it seems like with the amount of time we've been around, there doesn't seem to be that much of an alternative. But there might be, and it's just not yet been discovered. So if there is, obviously you go with the best route to go with the best course of action. But as of right now, it doesn't seem like that's known or understood. So I don't think there is, like, a different way that can be taken in terms of, like, what you're saying in general, like, you know, focusing the older voting population and stuff like that. But if there is a way that comes about, then absolutely I agree with you. But I can't think of one, and it looks like this organization that's been around for longer than I've been alive can't think of one. So whether or not that's there, I don't know. But if it is, I hope it's discovered, because obviously I want this to make waves. But if it's not, then hopefully what's being done will continue to evolve into a more effective method.
Okay. Let's finish up with what Sam was going to say.
Unfortunately, that's my last point. As I said before, I've got to leave early, unfortunately, sorry. Yeah, I think if we consider the idea of an alternative path, it brings us back to the crux of this debate, really, and the idea of the freedom of the press and the distribution of information. I mean, that's the key thing that seems to be effective, is the distribution of information. If you look at people who are supportive of these campaigns, they are people who have been exposed to the information directly. So the vast majority of young people are supported because they're more familiar with social media and certain accounts that are expressing this, distributing this information. And if you look at even popularity of David Attenborough among younger people now, it is constantly, seems to me, that it's getting the information out to people and it isn't quite there. And it's the right way about going about that, which seems to be how to persuade people. Because, like you say, there are many paths to going through this, and that's very true. But if you don't have the support of the people, then it's going to make it a lot harder to do that, and a lot harder to accept the changes, I think. So I think, because, like, with the idea that there's going to be a lot more government intervention in society to enforce these changes, you're going to have the support on the grassroots level. If you haven't got that, then that's the key issue. So I think getting the information out to persuade the general public is what is needed, really. And unfortunately, I've got to leave now. So it's nice to see you all. Have a good debate.
It's nice to have you. Bye.
Bye.
Okie dokie.
Could I just come back on that point, Kai? Is that okay?
Yeah. You finish off with that. Yeah.
Just to say that, following on from what the last person said, that and public support, that's a big part of why XR's third demand is as it is, in terms of our demand for the government to put in place a properly constituted, legally binding citizens' assembly. A large part of the purpose of which is to have a strong public mandate for the changes that need to happen, because it's not, XR doesn't try to tell people what to do in terms of specific actions or behaviours or policies. We don't want that. We want we want a citizens' assembly, which is a large group of properly randomly selected people who represent the population in a reflective of the population. We want them to be informed and have time and to come up with sensible proposals, which I trust that people absolutely would do if they were properly informed. So, that kind of thing done well would carry a lot more public mandate than has ever taken place.
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of the things that everyone seemed to be kind of talking about was just the presence of lots of different avenues of approaching this problem as far as getting people informed, because it seems like there's tons and tons of different ways of doing it, like reforming the press or getting the government to tell people to do stuff or that kind of thing. And perhaps one of the ways that we can approach like figuring out what a good solution would be to is by breaking down what we perceive to be is the problem. So one of the main things that is often brought up about this freedom of press in relation to climate change is the fact that there's a lot of incentive, and this was brought up by Ethan earlier, there's too much incentive to not talk about climate change. So the most obvious one is, well, there's two things. It's the fact that a lot of the key members who are editors or board meetings which involve editors at newspaper companies, they sit on fossil fuel company boards. And also the fact that a lot of the advertisers for these newspapers are things like HSBC, which rely on fossil fuel funding, and also sometimes just directly, just like fossil fuel companies will advertise. So there's just an implicit reason not to talk about climate change because it will mess up their income because of the fossil fuel boards and stuff like that. So do we think that as far as getting rid of that incentive and making sure that you can just talk about what you want in the press, is it fit for purpose if there are people with that kind of biases in inverted commas in those kind of positions with like
I don't
people in
think
boards
press
and
should be
stuff?
limited by like you shouldn't limit like information and spread of that by like someone's like one individual or one company's finances. Like especially with something that is on this much of a global scale, like if you're in a position where it's like if I talk about this thing, it might have positive impact, but I'll lose money. Obviously that's not how people would think about it and it's not how people would see the situation, but like I don't think that would be very fit for purpose, no. I feel like you shouldn't be in a position where you can limit or restrict the flow of information access based on what would make you profit. Like, you know, it feels like it's like if you publish this, it's like, oh, I've got like oil stocks or whatever. Let me just sell those and then publish this, and then like they can dip out earlier than other people and all that stuff, and that inherently gives them an advantage over other people, which means that they have like an indirect or like unconscious control over it, which they wouldn't necessarily do and say they're restricting access, but the decisions they make actually do. So I don't think that would be very fit for purpose, I guess, is my long-winded way of saying that.
Yeah, that's fair. Izzy, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just gonna agree that it's unfortunate because like that is a big problem, and which is like again to the different sources of information and the popularity of like how like the information comes across and like to people like and before it was mentioned that quite often like social media, like the profiles are quite often biased and things, but at the same time I don't think that we can exclude the fact that newspapers and different news sources are also biased by, like, for example, what you were saying about the fossil fuels, and by bigger companies who influence the information which is being put forward. So, yeah, I think that is a big thing. That's important to note. And I don't fully know how it would be possible to go about changing that, as and the biggest factor about why like climate change is being so pushed back and like and almost like not well, it's more mainstream, I guess, the understanding of it now and knowing that it's real and that it's happening right now, but it's still like underground, like the different factors. for example, like what Zoe was saying before, that I don't think many of us knew because, like, again, news sources don't tend to mention that. And the big problem is like the economic factor and the money that is that plays a big part in the in all the information that is being passed around, because it's just like a big industry, like the fossil fuels and various other industries which do impact climate change. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make sense. Tommy, you haven't. I don't know if your point was still relevant, but if you'd like to say it, then you should. No problem if not, though.
Did I have a point? What was the question again about biases? I mean, it's always it's a difficult problem because these economic biases from big companies are obviously really bad, especially in politics and the press. Well, especially politics, but also the press. And it's very hard to stop that in this sort of society, in the capitalist free market society. But like humans are always going to have biases, and that's the purpose of a free press, where you can have differing views. As someone said earlier, like the Guardian has many more things on climate change than other newspapers. So to that end, the free press is a good thing because it has a variety of different things. But if it is a big problem and big fossil fuel companies are funding like the majority of the press, that is a big problem. I don't really know how you could combat that.
Yeah. Go on, Zoe.
Yeah, gosh, I could probably speak for a long time here, so I'll try and keep it short. But I don't think we have a free press. If a handful of older white male billionaires own 80% of the UK media, as they do, and also have a massive influence on global media, like Rupert Murdoch, but also others, then we can't, by definition, have a free press because those voices drown out others, and that they are absolutely integrally connected to fossil fuels, and also, I think what also the story, whilst even the mainstream, even some of those right-wing media are over the last 2 years, no doubt connected to a whole range of things, including what Greta and school strikes have done, including what XR has done, and including the fact that, some of the impacts of climate breakdown are now so big you frankly can't ignore them, like the scale of last year's Australian fires that had to get reported somewhere. It's the size of France, you can't ignore it. But there are lots of things that still are completely ignored, and the interrelationship and interconnections between, for really importantly, systemic racism is largely not reported on, certainly not by the mainstream media. It's just not connected, and yet, as we sit here now, or stand here now, whatever you're doing, it's primarily people in the global south and black and brown people who are suffering primarily, and as well as right through to in UK, Europe, and the US. People of colour suffer more because of things like air pollution, because of deprivation, etc., and it's all connected. But we don't hear those stories in the mainstream media. Predominantly, we might hear some of it in the Guardian and more progressive parts of the media, but you just won't hear it otherwise. And what you do get on the front page of the Express and the Daily Mail, etc., is endless demonisation of other, endless demonisation of inverted commas migrants and etc. And that's just about, it's about, as far as I'm concerned, it's about dividing. It's about dividing us and teaching us about to distrust, dislike, and even hate other people and blame them for things. And that's what Hitler did, a long time ago, isn't it? It's what Hitler did in the 30s. And we know where that's going. So I'm really scared of the rise of fascism, personally, really, really scared of it. And you only have to look across the pond to what's been happening and what's been happening in the last few years in this country, and is still happening, in my view. So, and I'm not speaking as XR there. Of course, I'm just speaking as me, but and all of these things are interconnected. You know, in terms of what's been happening in Washington in the last few days, some of the climate misinformation and climate denial organizations that exist in the US and this country were taking to social media to express support for the insurrection, or the whatever you want to call it, the attempted coup at the Capitol. And so there is really a connection between the behind the scenes. The threads all connect to, you know, alt-right climate deniers and fossil fuels and fascism, and they're very much connected. And we don't see those connections unless we look for them, frankly, and that really worries me, because we can't afford to be naive on this stuff.
Yeah, it's the connections are definitely there, and uncovering them is definitely a very important part of that. One other thing that is an interesting sort of counter that some people say, but I'm not sure how much validity it has, is the fact that there are other better media sources out there. It makes me wonder how useful that is if people only stick to one source of media and that kind of thing. Just because it's
Ultimately,
available doesn't
with
mean people
having
use it.
we have there's the internet, so you can easily argue that like there's freedom of the press because the internet, and there's freedom of information because of the internet. But like, regardless of like the internet existing, like you can only be educated or be informed if you choose to be, and doubly so for if you allow your opinion to change on things. Like, you do need to be open-minded to this. You can have new information, but if you don't want to believe it, whether or not you're conscious of that fact, you're not going to change your opinion. You're not going to like even accept it as true in some cases, like climate deniers and anti-vaxxers and all that stuff. Even if those people are either plain malicious, or they stand to benefit from it, or if they're just absolutely terrified and want to do what's best for their children. In the case of many anti-vaxxers, I hope, because I don't actually know much about the community other than I disagree with it. So like, even if there's all this information here, even though there's all this information here, and all these independent groups and all these like standalone companies and all that stuff that do have the less involved media that isn't as controlled by people with a lot of influence and a lot of political or financial gain available from reporting about things in a certain way, it doesn't really matter, because you need to be like, the only people who read that are people who already agree with it. And that goes for like the alt-right websites as well and stuff like that. Like, the only people who read that are people who agree with it. The only people who interact in those forums are people who agree with it and all that stuff. So these things really only exist as echo chambers, as Sam said, because whilst theoretically they're really good, in actuality most people don't interact with them in the way that it's supposed to be done, which is like healthily or as part of a large mixture of media, and having different written viewpoints on the same reported thing. Like watching, I looked at a video, because obviously America is a very big thing right now, and I really need to stop because it makes me so sad. But it was the difference between MSNBC and Fox News reporting on it, and the difference was like Fox News reporting on the BLM movement was basically like these like, they would call them violent insurrectionists, and then what was happening in the Capitol, they would say that they are it's unconfirmed as to whether or not the violent aspect of these people were hired BLM actors or Antifa like insurgents or whatever. And it's hard to say if the violence was started in this crowd. It's like very obviously the difference. Then you go to like other news sources, like the only one I saw was MSNBC, was they were just like, this is disgusting. It's like a lack of they are trying to destroy American democracy. These people are terrorists and all that stuff. And it's like very clearly like a difference in thing. But if you believe the one side, like if you believe the more left-leaning side, you're going to watch MSNBC. If you believe the right-leaning side, you're going to watch Fox News. And ultimately that's just another echo chamber. Like like you need to expose yourself to these new things, but no one really wants to do that. Like, changing your opinion is challenging and difficult and takes a lot of time and convincing. If you've ever managed to convince someone, usually it'll take hours of a debate for them to even begin to question themselves and then go away and think about it more. But, that's my point, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll go for Izzy then. Tommy, what were you going to say, Izzy?
I do think that's a really interesting point actually, and I think it's definitely like really valid actually as a point. It is quite of an echo chamber, and I feel like in this case it's like people that I guess, like the different opinions of the different people because like I feel like each one of us has the responsibility of especially when we're like, for example, on the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's really important to have like conversations and like especially with people who don't necessarily have the same opinions of you, and to have these conversations and like do, especially as like we are like as a society systemically racist, and it's in the system, so like we are like like for example, I'm white, and therefore like obviously I've got the privilege to just ignore what is going on, but like and then yeah, like and stay in like again the echo chamber, and that's why I think it's so important to go and like talk to different people and talk to the people that are around you, to have these conversations, and to have debates on whatever, and I think like again social media is like good for that, like because we have like I don't know whether you're just whether you might be like an influencer or just like you've just got your friends following you, but you'll have friends that follow you with different views, and like even just sharing something that like for example I shared something on the various racist statues that were being pulled down, and like why they were being pulled down, and why these people were racist, and why the statue shouldn't be there. And I did get like replies about like that they did good things as well, and so it does like bring up conversations. Yeah, that's kind of what I want.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really, when you think about how like good it is, it's kind of just like talking, because you meet so many people with so many different opinions, and the way that people share information like that is you get all these different opinions. It's like following all the different newspapers on Instagram or something. We'll go for Tommy, then Zoe, and then we'll switch up to a little summary of what we've said so far. So Tommy?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with both of the previous speakers. I mean, conversation is definitely the most important thing you can do to learn about the world, to question your beliefs, because believing anything outside your current worldview, if you have a worldview, is insanely difficult, and you have to challenge yourself, definitely, and not be in an echo chamber, which I think social media is pretty much that. It's not very good for news. I wouldn't recommend it. Just like basically that, and also something you said earlier, Zoe. From I don't think it's fair to compare the like the right wing and like the demonizing newspapers to Hitler, because they had very different motives for what they're doing. I mean, the newspapers, I think, are mainly doing it in the pursuit of money, in the capitalistic market sort of thing. That they're writing for their readers, and that's why they do it. Whereas Hitler did it for a completely different reason. That's what just the point. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, I don't want to get into a debate about that because I don't think it's very fruitful for here. But I think that I would say just that there's corporate capture and billionaire influence, etc., of pretty much every politician, isn't there? Or certainly in this government and in the US, a lot but through funding and donations to parties and all the rest of it. So I don't think the making money and the political aims, etc., are completely separate. But anyway, that aside, I just wanted to sort of maybe bring our conversation back to the climate and ecological emergency, really, because I think it feels like we've kind of moved away from that a little bit. Although obviously the issues around social media being an echo chamber, and if we went back decades, then there would have been like not a single version of the truth, but a sort of a public story, and there wouldn't have been lots of different separate versions that people wouldn't have encountered. You would have had more of a single public story that people could understand and be part of and whatever. And we don't with the amount of social division and social media, we just have these separate stories. But coming back, I think some couple of specific points on the climate and ecological emergency that I think the surveys and studies have shown that actually the proportion of all-out climate deniers is much lower now. I think in the States it's about 15% or something, and over here in this country I think it's less than 10 now. I think so. Most people don't deny that this stuff's happening, which is good. So what am I trying to say? I think I'm trying to say that there's generally broad acceptance that climate change is real and it's happening and humans are causing it. I guess so I think in that sense it's a little bit different. It's not the pure kind of like political belief stuff. I think there is a lot of politics still in it, but actually there is more and more acceptance across the political spectrum. But where we need to go to is we need to go to a lot of places, don't we? But we need to get the information broadly understood by the public at large of exactly how serious this is, how urgent it is, and the pace and scale of action that's needed. And I've just given one example, but there's plenty more about things like tipping points in the Earth systems, for example, that people largely just don't understand in the public. I just imagine most politicians don't probably understand it properly either. So there's a lot of places that need to go, and I suppose as just an aside, I think the role, I might just be old-fashioned, so please do tell me if I am, but I do think the role of the BBC still is important, because I think if we think of early in the pandemic, for example, the BBC did a pretty good job of relentless COVID coverage. Maybe it's a bit more questionable more recently, perhaps, but relentless coverage to make sure people were aware and what they need to do and not do, etc. And it's that kind of level of coverage we need about the climate and ecological emergency. But they're not doing it, and actually they are increasingly sharing more explicit information, etc. But it tends to be tucked away. It's tucked away on news channels or specific bits of the Beebs output. It's not on the news at 10, news at 6, all the mainstream news, which is what it should be. And they still don't join the dots between things they need to be joining the dots about. So if you're listening to radio, in my case being an old git, might be listening to Radio 4, and there's a day programme or something, and they're mentioning something about climate, and the next breath they'll be interviewing the chief exec of Heathrow about, oh dear, Heathrow's struggling because of COVID. And you're thinking, hang on a minute, they should be joining the dots. They should be talking about how we shouldn't be expanding Heathrow and we should be drastically reducing flights. They just, they don't join the dots, and that kind of helps to kind of gaslight the public, really. And one last point is, I don't know if you guys saw it, because again, it didn't get massive coverage, but it did get a bit, is the newly appointed chair of the BBC used to work with Rishi Sunak as an ex-banker from Goldman Sachs. I think he's worth about $500 million himself, all of which aren't necessarily the end of the world, but he's also a director of one of the dark money think tanks from Tufton Street in London, which have connections to all sorts of dark money sources that people don't really know about, which is probably all sorts of stuff, including fossil fuels. And that think tank that he's a director of has been responsible for climate denial and climate misinformation as well. And this is the new chair of the BBC. So, this stuff just needs to be understood by people, and it doesn't fill me with hope that this BBC is really going to genuinely inform and educate the British public about the scale of the emergency we're in, and the scale of failure that our government are committing.
Yeah, that's fair. I was before you said about the new chair situation, I was kind of feeling like, oh, this is quite good about the BBC because they're like funded by. I mean, I don't exactly know what the situation for funding is, but it's a lot better than like private companies because it's not going to be directly funded by fossil fuel companies and stuff. So that is an advantage and probably has something to do with why they were doing all right with certain things like COVID and stuff. There was one other thing I want to say about social media before we do a little mini conclusion kind of thing. Just the fact that like there are, as we talked about just then, there are definitely good parts of social media, with like people sharing different opinions that they wouldn't normally and stuff, and that is definitely a good thing. But then equally, as Ethan said, there are definitely echo chambers in the internet as well, and I think it's the grain of truth good part that is keeping the internet as it is, because people associate the internet with the good stuff, and we don't want to get rid of the good stuff because it's good, rather than like acknowledging that there is bad parts of it as well. So it's a bit tricky. As far as the thing that you were saying about with the new BBC chairperson, I think it's quite interesting, and it'll be interesting to see if there's a shift in the BBC as far as coverage. But one of the things that I think is quite an important question to ask is that, say for example, we get all of the fossil fuel funding away from the press, and maybe there was a situation where all of that free, press is funded by like tax or the state or something, which is a bit dodgy in itself, but let's just pretend that that's like a good thing. So if we've got like a free press that's hasn't got any influences or hasn't got any disincentives to talk about stuff like that, because there's no financial like negatives of talking about climate denialism or stuff. So we've got a free press. Is it enough that we've got a free press and climate change comes up when it should be, and it doesn't not come up when it should be? Should there be something more than that? As in, do we need some sort of thing that makes sure that it's in public consciousness, not just it isn't not in our public consciousness, if that sort of makes sense? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, Kai, I mean, that's. I think if I've understood your point or question correctly, I mean, yes, absolutely. That that's XR's first demand. Tell the truth. You know, that the government and the BBC as part of the public service, you know, effectively an extension of public sector, but the government and all of its agencies should be spending a significant part of their time and energy and resources on ensuring the public actually do understand the reality and what needs to happen and how they can protect themselves and their families and future generations, because the government is here to look after us. That's the function of the government. And you know, that's why XR is in rebellion. That's why we declared rebellion against the UK government in October 2018, because they've broken the social contract. They're not actually looking after our interests anymore, because they're so roundedly failing on this stuff, along with almost every government on the planet. So, you know, that's why we're in rebellion, and we need to reconnect with that word and that purpose, because they have broken the social contract. They exist, the government exists to look after our long-term, not just immediate, but also long-term interests, and they're failing. So that's why we're in rebellion. And yes, our first demand, tell the truth. They need to be ensuring that everyone, adult and, you know, teenager and older person, etc., in the country actually understands. And we are a long way from that still, unfortunately, because, you know, you just have to think that Parliament declared a climate and environmental emergency back in May 2019 after we did the April Rebellion, but that's Parliament declaring it, not the government. So the government haven't declared it, but Parliament did. But you know, this government does not act like the truth is real, and we still need them. They're a long way from acting like the truth is real. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. And it's tricky because people do need to know about it, and it does make sense that it would be the government's responsibility because they're here to protect us and stuff. Just it kind of this idea like floats into my mind sometimes when I think about it. So say like through civil disobedience and protest and stuff, we get the government to be better about telling the truth and stuff, and I can't imagine how that would even happen. But let's just say that we get the first demand is like appropriately like accounted for. Is it kind of a bit of a nervous situation that like, so Extinction Rebellion did it for climate change because people, I think rightly, need to know about it, but then there are other movements like, I mean, like anti-vaxxers could rise up and form a rebellion and force the government to talk about. I mean, yeah, you can see what I mean. Like, it's a very powerful thing to have the government tell people about stuff. And one of the things that people would say about the government telling the truth is that it's vulnerable to abuse, as in like if a load of people can rise up and tell the government what to think, then it's kind of a bit scary that could happen with other views that maybe aren't so agreeable, like climate change, like it could, like the anti-vax thing. I don't know if that's a practical risk, or if anything, or if that's something that should be worried about, but just something that crept up on my mind.
I'd be interested to know what other people think, but in brief, I think what you're describing already happens, Kai. I think you only have to look at the way that our Home Secretary and others in government talk about people coming to this country to try and escape, to coming on boats across the Channel to try and escape hardship or whatever in their own countries, and they get totally vilified and spoken of as a threat. And the lawyers who are just doing their job and providing support for those people's human rights are called activist lawyers. They're not activist lawyers; they're lawyers. So quite a lot of the stuff that you're talking about in terms of how things are, it happens anyway because there are forces amongst government and forces behind government who are influencing what they're saying and those aren't public movements so much. They're the corporate interests and the parts of the Conservative Party, etc. So I think. And yeah, there could be other movements that I mean, you have to look at Marcus Rashford and what he did with his free school meals and stuff. But I don't think altogether we're not in control of that as XR. We need to do what we need to do because we believe it's the right thing to do for humanity and the non-human world. And I don't think we can worry about everything because I worry about enough as it is. I can't. I think we need to try and retain as much focus as we can, albeit a broad focus on what needs to change in the world. I don't know. That would be a personal view. I think these misinformation and stuff is happening anyway, and we're not about misinformation. We're about the exact opposite. We're about science and we're about truth. And we're about endlessly telling the truth to get the right thing to happen because we are out of time, pretty much.
Yeah, I think that's quite a sensible explanation of that. I think that does make sense. I don't know if anyone doesn't agree that makes sense, but
the only thing I have to say is humans can't worry about everything that's going on. God knows I can't. It's not a thing that you can do. Being informed is good, but like you can only take so much. You can only worry about so much because like ultimately you can't like be aware constantly of everything. It is grating to be aware of everything that's going on in the world, and it's difficult to focus on one thing because like with pretty much every issue, a lot of it is just a massive interconnected web. And it's like, oh, you go into this one thing and there's this issue, and it's like, oh, there's this avenue that's wrong with it, and this avenue ties into politics here, and there's this avenue which ties into foreign politics over there, and there's this avenue that ties into racism and institutionalization, and there's so much wrong. It's hard to keep track. Hence why this is supposed to be about climate change, but a large portion of it has been about social media and echo chambers and all of that stuff. Even if that was originally on freedom of the press, it's a massive breaching network of interconnected issues, and where if it was improved here, it would also improve here, and
yeah, that is completely true, I think, and it's difficult to be focused on certain things like that. As far as I mean, there are tons of examples that are quite useful to kind of like think about it in your head and then apply it to climate change. So, for example, like climate change denialism is a big issue, and similar things like anti-vaxxers and spreading disinformation or misinformation about the rigged election. It's definitely an issue, and it's harming a lot of people, but a lot of causes like Extinction Rebellion and stuff. So, just as far as specifically disinformation and that's right. As far as disinformation and misinformation, do we think blocking it is a good approach? As in, like, for example, Twitter took Donald Trump off because that was inciting violence, and that's quite an easy argument to make, that he's inciting violence, so that's bad and we need to block it. But for things like climate change denialism, it's not so much inciting violence that is the issue, it's the spreading of the lies and the eventual danger that it's going to cause about spreading those lies. So when it's a case like that, do we think that I think applying it to just climate change denialism is quite a good way of doing it. So is it right to block people and deplatform people for that, or should the discussion be available for people to see and then like talk it through and see how wrong it is, kind of thing?
I think on platforms that have pre-existing rules that state that, like, or, you know, like inciting violence and all that stuff, absolutely should. Like, I think the stuff that's like, you know, you can say it incites violence, it jeopardizes public safety. You know, if you deny, you know, climate change, then you deny actions to, you know, reduce drastic climate change and all that stuff, then, like, you are endangering everyone. If you are spreading lies about, you know, anti-vax stuff, you're endangering the lives of children. That's, like, while not direct at one person or group, it's, like, indirect violence. And obviously, stuff like Twitter, they're a private company, they're government regulated only in the way that private companies are. They don't have any responsibility to do stuff unless it's, like, you know, the law. But I think it should be deplatformed because it's dangerous. It is a danger to everyone if, like, misinformation exists. And, like, just in general, like, you know, you tell kids you shouldn't tell lies. So why can adults on the internet tell lies that trick people into not vaccinating children and then them dying because they had a preventable illness? You know, it's like, the truth in general is pretty good, especially when it comes to science. Any information furthers everything. Info is good. Like, if it's true, if it's false, why would you want that? It gets in the way, it clouds judgment, it clouds everything. It just makes life difficult for everyone. And, like, for the well-meaning people who fall prey to this stuff because they're just looking for what they want to be the best for their lives and their loved ones' lives, they fall prey to this stuff because they think it's right, you know. And that's bad, because what they're doing is they think it's right, and they think they're making the best choices for themselves and other people, but in actuality they've just fallen prey to misinformation. But if that wasn't on the platform, that group of people wouldn't be an issue. Like, they would be doing what is best for people, that is currently believed based on science that we have now. That very well may change when more info comes out, but it's certainly not going backwards because someone put out an article for someone who got paid off to make it, who was a doctor in the 1980s, that says vaccines give you autism. You know, like, I don't actually know when that doctor existed, or his name, but you know what I'm referencing to. So, like, they should certainly be deplatformed in any platform that can do that. I know there are exceptions, like privately owned stuff that does potentially allow it, because I don't think it's directly breaking any laws to spread misinformation. It's, like, only platform based. But I'm fairly certain on, like, Twitter, it's not something that's allowed, and they just let it happen.
Yep.
But if it is something that's allowed, they should not allow it.
Yep, but the problem comes when you just have to decide which bits of information is misinformation, and each platform chooses, and who knows if that's correct or not.
Yeah, it's the difficulty with the benefit and difficulty with privately owned platforms. There's various solutions it could make, like, you know, government enforcing, but there's also the issue of how the hell do you do that when everyone's online, and then, you know, there's different governments, and that needs to be something that's decided almost like on a worldwide basis or whatever. And so it's the solution is difficult, but in general, I don't think this information should be encouraged or really exist because it's just a problem. But yeah,
In
no.
principle, yeah.
In principle, but in
Yeah.
practice, if I had the solution, I would say it, but I'm dumb, and also, I don't fucking know. People will go to the length of the ends of the earth to say what they want. So,
Yeah, I definitely do agree with you, Tommy, and it's something that we'll get into it in a little bit. Zoe, what were you going to say? Just I'm conscious you're about to go soon.
Yeah, sorry, apologies. I do need to go in a sec. This is it's a tiny bit of a tangent, but I know there's been discussions or debates globally, hasn't there, about restrictions or regulation, rather, that's a better word, that are needed on social media platforms, and that there needs to be more regulation. And this issue about basically making them into publishers rather than just platforms. And I might have got the language wrong there, but that they claim no responsibility pretty much for what they're sharing, because they don't say it's their content. They're just creating a platform. Whereas actually, if they are treated as publishers, then they're responsible for their content. And I've heard, and I maybe I'm heard on some news, and it may be nonsense, and it may be me being hopey when I shouldn't be hopey. But I understand there's some hope that Biden might be stronger with the social media platforms, that most of which are based in the US, aren't they? Than certainly, obviously, than Trump's been. And if one of those things is heading towards making them more responsible for their content, then that can only help. Yeah, that can only help. But I think all of this is relevant, and of course, it's also totally relevant for movements like XR and brother and sister movements, of which there are obviously lots as well. We've all got to keep mobilizing, keep recruiting, keep spreading the word, regardless of what's happening, because the urgency and the scale means we don't have any choice. We have to keep going, and these things will change around us, and we just kind of keep going and keep adapting to what's changing.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
About our little deplatforming thing, I assumed someone was going to bring it up, but nobody did. I'm going to talk about the whole Trump and inciting violence thing, because it's a thing that's happened. He made, I don't know if he made it, but someone made an app called Parler, which was called a social media app for like right-wing people, and it was so that people who got deplatformed could go on it, and it was supposed to be like a freedom of speech kind of thing, so no one would ever get banned even if they said terrible things, I think. And now Google's suspended it from the Play Store, which is interesting. But as far as that being a thing that happens, and Trump said that he was going to consider making an app like this when he was kicked off. So what do you think about that as being a consequence that could make things worse?
I think it's just another echo chamber, so it's bad. Like, you look.
Parler's disgusting. Like, I mean, Trump didn't make it, but like I've seen screenshots, and they have like the N-word as a hashtag, and you can just use it. And it's just, you can literally say anything, and it's just full of right-wing fascists. So yeah, I think it definitely should be banned.
Yeah, like even if it was like, like a fully left-wing platform, I don't think that should exist either, because echo chambers are bad. And also, I think I don't think like Google's like, this is bad because they're saying like the bad things, whatever. I do think they have like other policies and stuff as well. Like they don't want to be responsible for, they don't want to be the company that hosts the app that, based on the attempted coup that they just did, they don't want to be the app that shares they don't want to be the company that shares an app that basically people are like, there's no consequence, so I can organize another rally which then turns violent. That was definitely not quote unquote intended to turn violent, when it very clearly was intended to turn violent. So like, no, that shouldn't exist. People shouldn't have that. And like, people will say freedom of speech, but there's also responsibilities that you have as a human. If like you have a right to the freedom of speech, but you also have the responsibility to use it like properly. you know.
With great power comes great
But
responsibility.
yeah, no, it's like
Yes.
there's one argument I read which is just really concise. It's like, why is it illegal to ask someone to kill someone? Like, all I'm doing is saying something. I have the freedom of speech, but that's like inciting violence. And
Mhm.
you know, the usage of slurs can technically, you can say, is inciting violence because it is channeling hatred towards one group, and that hatred usually spurs violence, and that's encouraging violence, which is indirectly jeopardizing the lives of marginalized people, especially in the USA.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of good with the Parler thing because I mean, it did get removed, but
Hmm.
say for example, it was a website or something, and there isn't anyone that owns like the websites, and obviously you could like DDoS it or something, but like things that can't be removed, that is a natural consequence of people getting deplatformed. And I definitely agree that these echo chambery things are bad, but in a situation where they can't like get killed, unlike Parler, is that a good consequence? Is that like an okay consequence of deplatforming people, that people will go onto that even if
I
they
feel
can't be
like
stopped?
Websites can be killed.
yeah, like there's avenues they can go down, but I feel like I can use like arguments of like, you know, gun law restrictions here. I like, even if it doesn't completely get rid of the problem, if we do everything we can to make it as difficult as possible, the only people who are gonna like the only websites of those that are going to exist are going to be like people who are like alt-right fascists who also own a server company, or like spend ridiculous amounts of money on servers to run their own constant freedomeagles.america website where they can host their own chat rooms and stuff talking about like lynching people. Obviously that's very extreme, but I'm fairly certain that that would happen. So like, even if it doesn't completely get rid of it, like Tommy said, there is avenues they can go down. Even if those fail, doing everything that we can as a society to make stuff like that spreads like dangerous stuff as difficult as possible to access is good. Even if we can't completely eradicate it, because there's like, people are always going to find a way. If they're desperate to say something that they want to say, they will find a way to say it, even if it's screaming it into the void with a group of people that they bought off Craigslist, you know.
I understand. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. It's tricky. Would you say, just like right now, given like what's happening with certain people being deplatformed in like a good way, do you think there's hope for things going in the right direction in the future, in your opinion?
It depends. I'm mostly aware of stuff that goes on in America because America has a lot of cultural influence over here, and also because the only news I watch is sadly
Just
on Reddit. Leave
interesting.
me alone. It's mostly just videos of protests and stuff that's going on, and because like America records a lot of its stuff, it has a lot more presence because it just has a lot more content coming out of it in like probably the worst possible way to say it, but like it has a lot more stuff there, so people see it a lot more. And I see it a lot of the stuff around America. That's why I don't know shit about British politics, even though I live here. I really should, but I don't know anything. I just kind of know that, like, yeah, people don't like politicians because they're bad, and there's some institutional issues here in Britain that have kind of been going on forever because of our society and, you know, history and all that stuff. But with America, I don't know. I find it difficult to be hopeful because it has been like, generously it's been 2 years. Actually, it's been his entire like presidency, and it's taken all of that for like Donald Trump to like become deplatformed on Twitter. Yet he's done and said all of these like awful things, and it's like, I don't know. Hope is a good thing to have, but it's difficult to place faith in a group of people whose police force literally is complacent with with a political coup to instill someone who his group of supporters have been recorded saying, if there was going to be a dictator, I want it to be Trump. That is something that people have genuinely said at Trump rallies. There's videos of it, which is insane because those very same people are the same people who are like, I hate communism because they think communism is fascism, and that, like, you know, freedom of speech in America first and all that stuff, but it's like you don't want that. You want Donald Trump to be a dictator. That's not. I don't know.
That's bad. That's no.
Hope is hard to have. It's I always have the little inkling of hope that things can get better, but looking at the way things go and things have been going, while I want there to be a general trend forwards, and I feel like there is, it is far too slow for my liking, if any, in some places. Mostly America is what I'm talking about. Here, a lot of our issues are less on the nose, and I think that comes with its own problems, because whilst they are less prevalent, it also means that they're more difficult to challenge and face, because it's a lot just, either behind the scenes or just kind of so accepted. With like all of the people in politics always being like really rich. That's like an inherent issue, because it's like already quite a biased viewpoint, because they're people who have money. So if you're ever making policies that affect poor people, you've never been in that position as like a politician, so you don't know what would help people. And then with the older generations as well, being like, rich and powerful, there's people who were, I think the stimulus checks in America, one of the main key speakers there who is responsible for passing that or whatever, their stance on it is like 2,000 will help someone in a year. And and people have noted how that no, because of inflation, and maybe when you were in that position, you were 20, 2,000 would have lasted a lot longer, but they're like 80 now, and it doesn't last nearly as long because things change, and they don't realize that, because the moment they passed that, they gained more money, so that has never really affected them.
Yes. I think that's true. There's one more thing. There's just one more thing that I'd like to ask. And I keep thinking about it, and I've refused to Google it for some reason. But can someone
Rude.
explain why, if the government just gave everyone £100,000, why would that break things? Wouldn't that just mean that everyone has more money?
What? Okay. What do you mean? I mean, none of us do economics.
No,
But,
not as in took money from the government's resources. I mean created money and gave it to people. Just handed out.
Do you mean
a million?
Are you saying
notes.
printing money, Kai, or not? This is a very important distinction, because there are several
Yeah,
countries
yeah.
that are like, don't ever do that again. Because printing money is awful, and it leads to just several horrible things happening, like the streets being
Kai,
paved with pound notes because they have no value.
In 2018, Venezuela's currency was worth less than WoW's currency.
Yeah. If you
Because
are
of
actually talking
inflation.
about printing money, it makes the value of money go down, because having more money means every single note of money is worthless, and there are so many countries that have made the materials that the money is made of. People have made houses out of their currency because they printed so much, because it is worth more as a brick than it is as a currency.
Why does that happen though?
Because basically, if you have one of one thing, it's worth one of itself. If you have two of the same thing, that's now depreciated half the value. So if I had a gold bar, and that's the only gold bar that ever existed, that is worth one gold bar. And that means it is basically valueless. Or it's invaluable because there's only one of it. And they've got two gold bars, that means each gold bar is incredibly expensive because there's only two of this in the world. It's like exclusive merch drops for YouTubers or whatever.
I see where this is going.
So with money, if there's lots of notes, then the value of the notes that exist goes down because there's lots of it. But if there's less notes, then the value of the existing notes go up because there's less of it.
From my understanding, we still go by the gold standard, which means each country has a certain amount of gold.
Yeah.
Which denotes how much their currency is worth. So you can only have a certain amount of currency if your currency wants to be worth that amount in the international standard.
Yeah.
And if we did print out a load of money, we wouldn't be able to trade internationally. I don't know the particulars, but it would create a load of problems with international trade.
It's like say using the gold standard. Say it was £100 to a gold, to a bar of gold.
To a gold.
To one whole gold. To if £100 was worth a bar of gold, that means £1 is worth 1/100th of a gold bar. You print so much money that now there is £1,000 to every gold bar. That means it's now 1/1000th of a gold bar to a pound. So the value of the coin goes down. The value of the pound goes down. So you'd need 10 times the amount of pounds to be worth the same amount as £1. So just printing money is a terrible idea and a child's solution to we don't have enough money, let's just print more. But if you're
But it
talking about
looks
like
cool.
stimulus checks and why the government doesn't just give people money, I can't comment on that because I don't know. But it certainly does. People do feel like they've paid their taxes. Why are they not getting money from the government when they can't actually work because of a global pandemic? And that's like a different argument entirely that I'm nowhere near informed enough to talk about.
Yeah, I don't know why countries can just like have deficits and increase them and randomly, and it doesn't affect anything. But like, yeah, I have no idea how deficits work. I really want to know.
It's
No.
very, very interesting. One of the things I wanted to talk about throughout as well is like issues with people in power and all that stuff. It's like it links to the media, links to politics and all that stuff. And that is like the people who naturally are drawn to positions of power. Here, there's the mixed issue of they are the ones who are like able to because they have the funding, but also those people are like the kinds of people who are going to do things that profit themselves over the general public. Like that's just a general personality type. I think that's a bit breaching, but like
I disagree with that.
That's
I think
that's perfectly fair.
generalizing
That's perfectly fair.
and is very. It's not fair to many politicians.
But I think like personally, you feel obviously you disagree, and that's perfectly fine. I understand why. I think people who are ambitious and in that way, and desire that, those people who chase power are the ones who usually make a lot of mistakes in the same vein that just kind of constantly happens. People who want power shouldn't have it. But that is, like you said, very generalizing. And even though I know it's generalizing, I still kind of believe that as like a general point for the majority of people who are, wanting that. But that is my own opinion. That is not, there's no information behind that. That's just what I feel is true. And I cannot encourage people to believe that without actually looking up any studies that exist, which I don't think they do, because that's very difficult to measure. But, that's my opinion. Please do disagree
I
with me.
imagine politicians go into politics for a variety of reasons.
Yes, obviously.
And a large part of that is going to be to make the country a better place as they see it.
Yeah.
And because you are on a different ideological scale than the current government, for example, you may see that as doing it for themselves and for power. But I don't think it's fair to just demonize the oppositional ideological mind frame.
Yeah, no, I don't intend to demonize everything. Like I said, just the majority, but that's still a problem. But yeah, no. There's no, yeah, no. It's like it is a viewpoint that I have myself, which is probably not the best to hold. But hopefully, what I think is, I just think that the country can be run better by doing different policies, and they believe they're doing everything. Like every choice that is being made is for the betterment of the people in the country, rather than for individual gain. But with a lot of the news coverage stuff that happens, I do begin to lose a little bit of faith, and that there are a lot of people who I think do make choices in government for personal gain. But that's my lack of faith in the government. That's not factual at all. That's just my lack of faith in it.
Ethan, you can base this on someone. I mean, James is probably like more right wing than the Conservatives.
Yeah.
And he's a perfectly nice person.
Yeah.
So it's not.
Oh no, I don't mean to demonize him. Not as a person. I mean I don't know. It's probably just like my lack of faith in like leadership and lack of trust in those in the government, rather than like me thinking I don't think they're all evil or whatever. I just think that I just lack the faith that I should have in our government and in governments in general.
Oh no! I mean, you shouldn't. I mean, you should never trust government.
Obviously,
governments have never been trusted.
Obviously, but that's my own personal lack of faith for several reasons of issues that are related or not. I believe they are, and I'm probably wrong. Hopefully, because if I am wrong, that means that my mistrust is misplaced, and that means the government's better than I think it is. So I hope I'm wrong, but I don't believe people who disagree with me or are, right wing. I don't believe the right wing is inherently bad. When I talk about like the alt right, that's the extreme right, and they are inherently bad, I believe, because any extreme version of a political belief is bad, because extremism is bad, because it just leads to problems. But being right wing just means that they have a differing view on the economy. Like James, use James's example, we have differing views on taxes. That's the most boring way I can think of it. And I have a different opinion on how I think tax would benefit the people than he does. And that's fine. I don't think he's bad for thinking that. I just disagree with him because I think my way of doing things would be better, and so does he. That's fine. But yeah, no, this is just I need to stop talking. I just need to stop talking.
Just out of interest, because I don't know how much I believe it. I think it's sort of true and sort of isn't, in my opinion. Can you think of any ways of applying that, like what you think about it, like in a way that would benefit society, if that is like true, the kind of thing?
Well, like my views on taxes, or
no, the thing. I'm going to butcher it, but like people who go into power are kind of not greatly suited for it, kind of thing, because they want power.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. That's why it's like an irrational belief that I have. There is no way to go about it, because you can't force people into a job they don't want to do, because that's awful and you shouldn't do that. The only way that would mitigate that would be, I guess, like kind of like jury duty, I guess. But instead of with prisons, it's just like, I guess what Zoe said, having a randomly selected portion of groups that is a decent spread of representation of the population and different people's views. Having those people in there as sort of like a voice of the people, so to speak, that isn't just one person that's a political figure. Actually having these people that change all the time, so they aren't constantly in, and they can't be like bribed or whatever. Not that I think politicians do, but they have been in the past. So having that voice of the people, literally, to put it in the most patriotic way possible, is a good way to mitigate people, and it's a good voice of counsel, I believe. But then there's the argument that they're not necessarily qualified for it. But I think a decision that affects the public definitely has a right to it. But that's very difficult to implement, because that's like making every election a general election. Like it has to involve people, but it's only a small group. So I think that's like reasonable. That's my understanding of what she said. She might have meant something different when she used the actual smart person words, and I'm a dumbass, and something about like a civil republic. No, that's wrong. I don't know.
Citizens Assembly.
That's it. Yeah, Citizens Assembly. I feel like that's a decent idea because it can't really harm anything, can it?
It's used on specific idea, whatever you call them, votes. I mean, what am I saying? Specific.
I don't know. I'm stupid.
Issues,
yeah,
not like governments, because they can't deal with the complexity of entire governments. They're supposed to be focused on a single issue.
Yeah.
They don't make policy; they just discuss it and find out what's best, kind of thing.
That's fair. So, like, I don't think there's like that's why what I think is rational. There's no solution to this problem. It's like like wanting power is evil, go to hell sort of thing. Like it's like an inherent flaw in humanity that whilst I don't fully believe, I also kind of do. And I do need to stop that, because it means I obviously have a nicer outlook on life. But I think I'll be more convinced when a lot of global issues start dying down. So there is no solution to what I think, because it's inherently like irrational. Like it's me thinking that people who want to do this are always going to make mistakes. And whilst mistakes will always happen, that way of thinking means the majority of people making those mistakes do so maliciously or on purpose for their own personal gain, which is almost certainly not true, but I still have that slight bit of but what if in my head that dominates me. Which no one should have, because it's bad and it just makes you sad, so don't think like me. But I think like me, so I have to deal with this.
Okay. Well, so enough of Ethan's flaws.
Yes, enough of my rambling. Is that the last issue? Is it closing time? If I kept you here for like an hour long,
I'd like to say that. Lol. We should definitely debate citizens' assemblies at some point. Is the only thing that I will say, apart from the goodbyes, which we will now talk about. But yeah. Everybody say bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
It was a
Thank you.
it was delightful.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.